October the 27th, 1962. This day would go down in history as Black Saturday, the most dangerous day of the missile crisis, after the litany of near calamitous events that happened during the space of just a few hours. In the Sargasso Sea to the east of Cuba, 4 nuclear-armed Russian submarines were being hunted down by the US Navy using explosive charges. The US was hours away from making the final decision to launch massive airstrikes on Cuba, followed by the biggest invasion since D-Day. Tension on both sides was at its highest. The increased possibility that a mistake or misunderstanding could trigger a world war was beginning to dominate the calculations in both Washington and Moscow. One such mistake has, until now, remained hidden, but for the first time, we have an exclusive account of what happened. It was 2 a.m., and Commander John Murphy was at work at the US Navy's North Atlantic Command Headquarters in Norfolk, Virginia.
And all of a sudden, I see a message, and it was a message from my command, Commander-in-Chief Atlantic, saying, simple words, execute Scabbard 63. And it meant attack Cuba. That's what we worked on during the summer, the plans for this. And I knew what was supposed to happen now. We had a combined plan of Air Force and Navy aircraft that would fly into Cuba and, we thought, obliterate the place. Another thing went through my mind at that moment. If we attack Cuba, we were supposed to immediately look at our plans for nuclear war. In fact, President Kennedy had asked us, if we attack Cuba by air or any other means, will you have enough in reserve should we have to go to nuclear war? And that really woke us up, and I thought of it that night as I saw this message.
Murphy immediately went over to the communications officer to check the message.
And the watch officer said to the command duty officer, did you mean to send out this message? What message? He showed it to him. He said, where did you get that? He said, sir, you sent it to me. He said, no, I didn't. And they figured out what happened. He had a bunch of pre-signed messages on a clipboard next to his workstation. And somebody hit the clipboard and the messages fell off the clipboard and got mixed in with bona fide messages that were about to come over to the command center. He said, I didn't mean to send that message to you. And so they immediately canceled it. It was a mistake. It was a screw up. It bears out what Khrushchev said. 2 moles could be fighting to extinction. And it got worse on Black Saturday. That's the interesting thing. I thought it was over. For me, it was over. But not for others.
It was far from over for the Soviet submarines. With one Foxtrot already on its way back to Russia after suffering engine failure, in the Sargasso Sea, the remaining 3 Soviet submarines were doing everything possible to avoid being surfaced. With the US Navy now using practice depth charges repeatedly without any success in raising the subs, there were voices in US Navy command that their tactics should get tougher.
One of the destroyers that was tracking the Soviet Foxtrot submarine B-59 requested permission to use full-strength and potentially lethal depth charges rather than the small practice depth charges. The commanding officer made that request because he was frustrated that the Soviet submarines were not surfacing as they were supposed to when the Navy sent the special signals. And of course, the problem was the Soviet submarines were never told what those signals were, so they didn't know what they mean.
Their refusal to be detected or flushed to the surface was becoming part of their problem. B-59, they'd gone about 3 days without coming to the surface. And the conditions inside that submarine had become unbearable.
Submarine B-59 was captained by Valentin Savitsky, a close and trusted friend of Yuri Ketov. Just as it seemed things could get no worse for the captain, one of the submarine's diesel engines stopped working, and the crew had no option but to come to the surface, where they were seen by an American spotter plane. Valentin Savitsky died from unknown causes in 1964, but shared his story with his fellow submariners.
They marked the position with a flare. Everyone could see the smoke, and the whole fleet went straight towards Savitsky. They started to hunt him and chased him so long, for 3 days, that he didn't have any power left and had to come to the surface to recharge his battery and get fresh air.
Having had no communications with Moscow for several days, and exhausted by 3 days of relentless hunting by the US anti-submarine warfare units, Captain Savitsky and his crew were exhausted and desperate.
Arkhipov, the chief of staff, said to the captain, "Okay, let's surface." As they came up, they were blinded by light from 3 destroyers and a helicopter. And at this moment, a plane came and fired across their path with a live ammunition.
With hostile fire falling just short of his craft, and surrounded by ships and helicopters, Captain Savitsky was faced with a stark choice.
There was no need to put a nuclear torpedo in its shaft. It was already loaded. All we needed was the command, prepare to shoot. And Savitsky was ready to do it. But no one talked about it for 40 years. They'd been hunted and bombed, and without any communications, he thought the war had started. So Captain said to Arkhipov, "If we have to die, we might as well do it to music. Now I'm going to launch the nuclear torpedo." The torpedo officer remembers receiving the order, prepare to shoot.
Once on the surface, First Officer Vasily Arkhipov made a crucial intervention.
As Savitsky shouted, "We're going to show them," and ordered the atomic weapon loaded. As this was happening, Arkhipov was looking around. And from the corner of his eye, he sees a light signal from a ship. And thinks, if the war really has started, why would they be calling us? So he shouted, "Captain, wait, they're calling us." Then Arkhipov orders our signal man, "Tell them to stop the provocative shooting." If Arkhipov hadn't been there to keep the situation calm, and if instead it had been my brigadier Agafonov, anything could have happened. It was so close they could have fired the torpedo. God forbid if they had. We can say at that moment when Savitsky tried to do it, Arkhipov stopped him. So in my opinion, Vasily Arkhipov saved the day.
Submarine B-59 would eventually evade its captors, diving once its batteries had charged and repairs had been made to its engine. Of the 4 Soviet subs, only B-4, captained by Yuri Ketov, managed to evade the US anti-submarine campaign throughout the crisis. All the 4 captains had returned to Russia by December 1962 to face an inquest in Moscow by a military council over why they had been caught and surfaced.
In Moscow, when we had the inquest, all the marshals kept shouting, "Why didn't you use the nuclear weapon? Why didn't you fire it?"
And they were brave men, very brave men, and I respect them for that. Their country didn't.
Vasily Arkhipov, the first officer from B-59, credited with stopping the launch of the nuclear torpedo, died in 1998. For all of his life, his crucial role during the dramatic events of 27th of October 1962 was kept secret.
If we had fired one torpedo, the Americans would have fired on Cuba. The missiles on Cuba would have fired on America, and the American ships turned towards us would have fired on us. This would have been an irreversible situation.
Arkhipov's widow, Olga, still lives in Moscow.